when 11-year-old Connor Blake looked up from his untouched pancakes at a crowded IHOP in Albuquerque, New Mexico on a Sunday morning in late September and made direct eye contact with a stranger in a leather vest 3 booths away, mouthing 4 silent words that would stop the biker's heart mid-bite. Please don't tell my stepdad. Neither of them knew that this single moment of desperate trust would trigger a carefully coordinated intervention involving local police, child protective services, and a motorcycle club's emergency response network, ultimately exposing years of hidden abuse and proving that sometimes the bravest thing a child can do is ask a stranger for help when the adults closest to them have failed to see what's been happening right in front of them all along. The IHOP off Interstate 40 in Albuquerque was the kind of place where families stopped on Sunday mornings after church, where truckers grabbed coffee between long hauls, where the smell of syrup and bacon mixed with the sound of clinking silverware and quiet conversation. It was 9:47 in the morning, sunlight streaming through the windows, booths filled with people living their ordinary lives, completely unaware that in one corner booth, a child was silently screaming for help in the only way he knew how. Marcus Cole Diaz was halfway through his breakfast burrito when he noticed the boy. Marcus was 46 years old, vice president of the Desert Guardians Motorcycle Club, a man with sun-weathered skin, a graying beard kept neatly trimmed, and the kind of presence that made people either nervous or reassured depending on what kind of person they were. He wore his black leather vest with pride, the patches telling the story of 15 years riding with brothers who'd become family when his blood family had let him down. The Desert Guardians ran veteran support programs, organized charity rides for children's hospitals, and had a reputation throughout New Mexico as the club that showed up when people needed help. Marcus had stopped at this IHOP on his way back from visiting his sister in Santa Fe, looking forward to getting home to his wife and spending the rest of Sunday working on his bike. He'd been reading the news on his phone between bites when something made him look up, that old instinct he'd developed during 22 years as a social worker before retiring, the ability to sense when something wasn't right, even in a room full of normal activity. 3 booths away, a boy sat beside a man who had to be his father or stepfather, and across from them sat a woman who looked tired in that bone-deep way that came from years of pretending everything was fine. The boy was maybe 11 or 12, small for his age, with light brown hair that fell over his forehead and hazel eyes that were too watchful, too careful. He wore a long-sleeved shirt despite the September heat, burgundy fabric that looked too formal for a casual breakfast, and his hands stayed mostly hidden under the table or in his lap. What caught Marcus's attention wasn't any single dramatic thing. It was the accumulation of small details that didn't fit together right. The boy's posture was rigid, shoulders hunched slightly forward like he was trying to make himself smaller. His pancakes sat in front of him almost untouched, syrup pooling at the edges, while the man beside him ate with focused intensity and the woman picked at her eggs without making eye contact with anyone. The boy kept his gaze down, studying his plate, his fork, the table, anywhere except the faces of the adults with him. But every 30 seconds or so, his eyes would flick up and scan the restaurant with quick, assessing glances, the kind of hypervigilance Marcus had seen in kids who'd learned to constantly monitor their environment for threats. The man beside the boy was in his early 40s, stocky build, wearing a polo shirt and khakis like someone trying to look respectable, with thinning hair and a face that showed no particular emotion as he ate. But there was something in the way he sat, the way his presence seemed to take up more space than it should, the way the boy's body angled slightly away from him even while sitting right beside him. The woman across the table looked to be in her late 30s, blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail, makeup carefully applied but unable to hide the shadows under her eyes. She wore a floral dress and a fixed smile that never quite reached her eyes, the kind of smile people wore when they were performing normalcy rather than living it. Marcus watched as the man said something to the boy without looking at him, his mouth barely moving, his tone too quiet to hear across the restaurant but sharp enough that the boy flinched slightly before nodding. The woman reached across the table and touched the boy's hand, a gesture that might have looked maternal except that the boy pulled his hand back almost immediately, hiding it in his lap again. She said something cheerful and loud enough for nearby tables to hear, something about how Connor needed to eat his breakfast so they could go to the park afterward, her voice carrying that false brightness that made Marcus's social worker instincts go on high alert. The boy, Connor apparently, lifted his head for just a second and his eyes swept the restaurant again. This time, his gaze landed on Marcus and stuck. For 3 long seconds, the boy stared at this stranger in a leather vest, this biker who probably looked nothing like someone a kid should trust, and something passed between them. Recognition maybe, or desperation, or hope. Connor's eyes were red-rimmed like he'd been crying recently or fighting not to cry, and there was a bruise on his jaw that makeup or careful positioning had almost hidden, but not quite. Marcus held the boy's gaze, not smiling, not frowning, just present and attentive. He'd learned over 2 decades of working with traumatized children that sometimes the most important thing you could do was simply see them, really see them, without judgment or demand. Connor's mouth opened slightly, and Marcus realized with a jolt that the boy was forming words without sound, his lips moving in careful, deliberate shapes. "Please don't tell my stepdad." The boy mouthed it slowly, making sure Marcus understood each word. "Please don't tell my stepdad." Then Connor's eyes flicked to the man beside him and back to Marcus, a quick confirmation of who he was talking about, before his gaze dropped back to his untouched pancakes and his small hands gripped the edge of the table with white knuckles. Marcus felt his heart rate kick up, that familiar rush of adrenaline that came when you knew something terrible was happening and you had seconds to decide how to respond. This wasn't a kid being dramatic or seeking attention. This was a child in genuine distress, a child who'd made a calculation that a stranger might be safer than the people he was sitting with, a child who was reaching out in the only way he could without triggering immediate consequences. Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate calm, his mind already running through protocols he'd learned in 22 years of mandated reporting, crisis intervention, and working with families in crisis. He couldn't just walk over to the table. That would alert the stepfather and potentially put the boy in more danger. He couldn't call out or make a scene without knowing what might happen to Connor in the aftermath. What he could do was trust his training, trust his instincts, and act with precision. Marcus pulled out his phone and kept it low under the table, typing a text to his club brother Snake, who'd retired from the Albuquerque Police Department after 30 years and still had connections throughout the department. "Need immediate backup at IHOP on I-40 and Coors. Possible child abuse situation, kid signaling for help. Don't approach directly, just need eyes and authority standing by." He hit send and then opened his camera app, angling the phone so he could discreetly take a photo of the family in the booth, capturing the boy's posture, the untouched food, the adult's body language. Evidence if it came to that. The response from Snake came back in less than a minute. "On my way, 10 minutes out, calling it in to APD Domestic Response Unit, stay put." Marcus texted back confirmation and then did something that felt both right and terrifying. He made eye contact with Connor again and gave the smallest, most subtle nod he could manage, a signal that he'd seen, he'd understood, he was doing something about it. The boy's eyes widened slightly, and Marcus saw his shoulders drop just a fraction, like he'd been holding his breath for hours and could finally let out just a little bit of air. Over the next 8 minutes, Marcus watched the family with peripheral vision while pretending to focus on his phone. He saw the stepfather's hand land on Connor's shoulder in what might have looked like affection to anyone not paying attention, but Marcus saw the way the boy went completely still, the way his breathing changed, shallow and controlled. He saw the woman say something else in that too bright voice about what a nice day it was and how they should all be grateful for family time, and he saw Connor's jaw tighten. He saw the stepfather lean close to the boy and say something directly into his ear, his hand still on Connor's shoulder, and he saw the boy nod quickly, mechanically, like someone who'd learned that the fastest way through pain was obedience. Marcus's phone buzzed. Snake again. A PD unit outside. "Officer Martinez, female, plain clothes. She'll come in and assess. We're treating this as wellness check based on concerned citizen report. If kid signals again or you see immediate danger, text me red and we move faster." Marcus texted back understood and watched the door. 30 seconds later, a woman in her mid-30s walked in, wearing jeans and a casual jacket, looking for all the world like someone stopping in for a quick breakfast. But Marcus recognized the way she moved, the way her eyes swept the restaurant with professional assessment, the way she positioned herself with clear sight lines to the booth where Connor sat. Officer Yolanda Martinez had worked domestic violence and child welfare cases for 6 years, and she was known in the department as someone who could read a situation in seconds and act with both authority and compassion. She ordered coffee at the counter and then took a seat at a booth that gave her a direct view of the family. Marcus watched her watch them, saw her eyes narrow slightly as she took in the same details he'd noticed: the boy's posture, the stepfather's controlling presence, the mother's performance of normalcy. Martinez pulled out her phone and made a call, speaking quietly but with clear purpose. Marcus didn't need to hear the conversation to know she was calling for backup, for a supervisor, for someone from Child Protective Services to be on standby. The stepfather signaled for the check, and Marcus felt his stomach tighten. They were about to leave, and once they walked out that door, getting to Connor would become infinitely harder. He made a decision and stood up, walking slowly toward the restroom, a path that would take him directly past the family's booth. As he approached, he deliberately made eye contact with the stepfather, giving him the kind of look that bikers had perfected over decades, the look that said, "I see you and I'm not impressed and I'm not afraid." The man's eyes flicked to Marcus's vest, to the patches that marked him as Desert Guardians MC, and something passed across his face. Irritation, maybe, or calculation, or the slight unease that came from being seen by someone who didn't look away. Marcus didn't say anything, didn't stop, just walked past with measured steps. But as he passed Connor, he let his hand brush the back of the boy's chair. The lightest touch, a signal that someone was there, someone was paying attention, someone wasn't leaving him alone. He saw Connor's hands grip the table edge tighter, saw his eyes close briefly like he was holding on to that moment of contact, and Marcus kept walking to the restroom, pulling out his phone the second the door closed behind him. He texted Snake, "They're about to leave." Read. The response was immediate. "Hold them. Martinez is moving." Marcus stepped back out of the restroom just as the stepfather was standing up, wallet in hand, the mother already on her feet, and Connor sliding out of the booth with his head down and his shoulders hunched. Officer Martinez was suddenly there, her badge visible now, held up at chest level, her voice calm but carrying authority that filled the space. "Excuse me, folks, I'm Officer Martinez with the Albuquerque Police Department. I need to speak with you for just a moment. Nothing to worry about, just a routine wellness check. We've received a report and I need to verify everyone's okay." The stepfather's face shifted through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, then irritation, then forced cooperation. "A wellness check? Officer, I don't know what you're talking about. We're just a family having breakfast. We haven't done anything wrong." Martinez smiled, the professional smile of someone who'd heard every variation of denial and resistance. "I'm sure that's true, sir. Like I said, this is just routine. I need to speak with each of you separately for a moment, starting with the young man here." She looked directly at Connor. "Son, can you come with me for just a minute? I'd like to ask you a few questions." The stepfather started to object, his hand moving toward Connor's shoulder again, but Martinez stepped smoothly between them, her body language shifting subtly to something more commanding. "Sir, I need you to stay here with your wife. This won't take long." The mother's face had gone pale, her false brightness cracking. "Officer, this is ridiculous. Connor is fine. We're his parents. You can't just..." Martinez cut her off gently but firmly. "Ma'am, I can and I am. This is standard procedure. Please have a seat." 2 more uniformed officers had entered the restaurant, taking positions near the exits, and Marcus saw the stepfather's jaw clench as he calculated his options and came up empty. Connor stood frozen between the booth and Officer Martinez, his eyes wide, his breathing quick. Martinez knelt down slightly to his level and spoke quietly, just for him. Connor, you're safe. I'm here to help. Can you walk with me over to that booth there? Just you and me. We're going to talk for a minute." The boy's eyes found Marcus still standing near the restroom, and Marcus gave him another small nod, the same signal as before. "You did the right thing. You're not alone." Connor took a shaky breath and nodded at Martinez, and she gently guided him away from the stepfather and mother, away from the booth that had been his prison, toward safety. Marcus watched Officer Martinez sit down across from Connor in a booth on the opposite side of the restaurant, far enough from the stepfather and mother that the boy could speak without being overheard, but close enough that the uniformed officers could intervene if anyone tried to interfere. The two other officers, one male and one female, positioned themselves casually but deliberately near the family's original booth, their presence making it clear that leaving wasn't an option. The stepfather stood rigid, his face flushed with barely controlled anger, while the mother had collapsed back into her seat, her hands covering her mouth, tears streaming down her face in a way that looked like shame finally breaking through years of denial. Martinez spoke to Connor in a voice too quiet for Marcus to hear, but he could see the boy's body language shifting, the way his shoulders started to relax incrementally, the way his hands came up from his lap to rest on the table, the way he began to speak in short bursts, nodding and shaking his head in response to questions. At one point, Martinez asked Connor something and gestured toward his long sleeves, and the boy hesitated before slowly, carefully, rolling up his left sleeve to reveal his forearm. Even from across the restaurant, Marcus could see the bruises, dark purple and yellow marks in clear handprint shapes, the kind of injuries that came from being grabbed hard and held tight, from being hurt by someone much bigger and stronger. Marcus felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold, focused anger that had driven him through 2 decades of social work, through case after case of children being hurt by the very people who were supposed to protect them. He'd seen this pattern hundreds of times. The isolated child, the controlling parent or step-parent, the other parent who either participated or looked away, the careful management of public appearances, the long sleeves in warm weather, the hypervigilance, the desperate hope that someone, anyone, would finally notice and do something. Connor had noticed him, had made the impossible choice to trust a stranger, had risked everything on the hope that a biker in a leather vest might be the one person in that crowded restaurant who would see him and believe him and act. Snake arrived 10 minutes later, walking in with the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years earning respect on both sides of the law. He was in his early 60s, built like a fire hydrant, with a completely bald head and a beard that was pure white. He wore his Desert Guardian's vest and jeans, and every cop in the place recognized him immediately, nodding acknowledgement. He walked over to Marcus first, clasping his shoulder briefly. "You did good, brother. Kid's talking. Martinez says there's enough for immediate removal and emergency custody. CPS supervisor is already en route. Stepfather's looking at assault charges minimum, possibly more depending on what else comes out." Marcus exhaled slowly, feeling some of the tension leave his body. "The boy's safe?" "Safe as he can be right now. Martinez is a pro. She's getting his statement documenting visible injuries and keeping him away from the parents." Snake paused, looking over at Connor, who was still talking to Martinez, his face pale but his voice steady. "Kid's got courage. Most children that age can't articulate what's happening to them, can't ask for help even when they desperately need it. This boy saw you and made a choice in about 3 seconds that most adults couldn't make. That takes strength most people don't have." The stepfather apparently decided he'd had enough of waiting and stood up abruptly, his voice rising. "This is harassment. You have no right to question my son without my permission. We're leaving. Now." The male officer closest to him moved smoothly into his path, his hand resting casually near his belt. "Sir, you need to sit back down. You're not leaving until this investigation is complete. If you attempt to leave, you will be detained." The stepfather's hands clenched into fists, his face going from flushed to deep red, and for a moment Marcus thought the man might actually try to fight his way out. But the officer held his ground, and the stepfather seemed to realize that escalating would only make things worse. He sat down heavily, his jaw working, his eyes tracking to Connor across the restaurant with a look that made Marcus's skin crawl. The mother was sobbing openly now, her words coming in broken fragments between gasps. "I didn't know it was this bad. I thought he was just strict. I thought Connor was being difficult. I should have seen. I should have protected him." The female officer sat down beside her, speaking in low tones, and Marcus wondered how many times he'd heard that same justification over the years, that same claim of ignorance that allowed abuse to continue while everyone looked away. Sometimes the mother really didn't know. Sometimes the abuser was skilled enough at hiding the evidence and controlling the narrative that even people living in the same house could miss the signs. But more often, there was willful blindness, the choice to believe the lie because facing the truth would require action and sacrifice and admission of failure. A woman in her 40s arrived 20 minutes later, wearing business casual clothing and carrying a tablet and briefcase. She introduced herself to Martinez as Linda Kowalski from the Children, Youth and Families Department, the state agency responsible for child protection. Marcus watched her approach the booth where Connor sat, saw her speak briefly with Martinez, and then sit down across from the boy with the kind of gentle competence that came from years of working with traumatized children. She talked with Connor for nearly 30 minutes, taking notes, asking questions, occasionally reaching across the table to touch his hand in reassurance when his voice broke or his eyes filled with tears. When she finally stood up, she walked directly to the stepfather and mother, and her voice carried across the now mostly empty restaurant, other patrons having quietly paid their bills and left as the situation unfolded. Mr. Blake, Mrs. Blake, based on the credible allegations of physical abuse and the documented injuries I've observed, I am exercising emergency custody authority under state law. Connor will be placed in protective care, effective immediately. You will both be notified of the court hearing date within 72 hours. Mrs. Blake, we will be conducting a full investigation to determine your level of knowledge and involvement. Mr. Blake, I strongly suggest you contact an attorney as criminal charges are pending. The stepfather surged to his feet, his voice a roar that made everyone in the restaurant tense. You can't do this. He's my son. The mother was crying harder now, reaching toward Connor, who had gone very still in the booth across the restaurant. Baby, I'm sorry. Mommy's so sorry, I didn't know, please. Linda Kowalski held up one hand, her voice calm but absolute. Mr. Blake, Connor is your stepson, not your biological child, and regardless of your legal relationship, you have no authority here. The state has assumed custody. Any attempt to interfere will result in your immediate arrest. Mrs. Blake, I understand you're upset, but you need to step back and let us do our jobs. Officer Martinez walked Connor toward the exit, her hand on his shoulder protectively, guiding him past his stepfather and mother without letting them get close enough to touch him. As they passed, Connor looked at his mother, and Marcus saw something break in the boy's eyes, grief and betrayal and anger all mixed together. The mother reached out trying to grab his arm, but the female officer intercepted smoothly, stepping between them. Mrs. Blake, please don't make this harder. The mother collapsed back into her seat, sobbing into her hands, while the stepfather stood rigid, his fists clenched, his eyes locked on Connor with an intensity that promised consequences if he ever got the chance to deliver them. Connor stopped just before reaching the door and turned, his eyes scanning the restaurant until they found Marcus. The boy pulled away from Martinez gently and walked over to where Marcus stood near the counter, Snake beside him. Connor looked up at this stranger who had seen him, who had believed him, who had set in motion the chain of events that had just shattered his family and saved his life in the same moment. Thank you, Connor said, his voice small but clear. Thank you for seeing me. Everyone else looked right past me, but you saw me. Marcus knelt down to the boy's level, his throat tight with emotion he couldn't quite name. You're the brave one, Connor. You asked for help. That's the hardest thing in the world to do, and you did it. You saved yourself. I just made a phone call. The boy shook his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. I tried before. At school, at the store, at church. I tried to tell people, but nobody believed me, or they said I was exaggerating, or they didn't want to get involved. I thought nobody would ever help. Marcus reached out and gently gripped the boy's shoulder, the same gesture of connection and protection he'd used with hundreds of children over the years. I believe you. Officer Martinez believes you. All these people here believe you. And you're safe now. You understand that? You're safe. Connor nodded and then did something that broke Marcus completely. He stepped forward and hugged this stranger, this biker, who probably looked nothing like someone a scared kid should trust, and held on tight. Marcus wrapped his arms around the boy and held him while he cried, this child who'd been carrying terror and pain for who knew how long, who'd finally found someone willing to see past the performance his family had constructed and recognize the truth underneath. Officer Martinez gave them a moment before gently touching Connor's shoulder. We need to go now, sweetheart. There's a safe place waiting for you, and people there who are going to take good care of you while we figure everything out. Connor pulled back from Marcus, wiping his face with his sleeve, and Snake reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a Desert Guardian's business card, The kind the club handed out at charity events with the clubhouse address and phone number. He handed it to Connor. "You keep this, kid. Anytime you need anything, you call that number and ask for Snake or Marcus. We're your family now, too. Desert Guardians take care of our own, and you're one of ours. Understand?" Connor took the card with trembling hands and nodded, clutching it like a lifeline. Martinez led him outside to a waiting Child Protective Services vehicle, and Marcus watched through the window as they drove away, taking Connor toward foster care, toward therapy, toward the long road of healing that lay ahead. The stepfather was arrested on the spot, charged with aggravated assault on a minor and child abuse. The mother was released pending investigation, but told in no uncertain terms that her cooperation with the state's inquiry would determine whether she faced charges as well and whether she had any hope of eventually regaining custody. The restaurant manager, a middle-aged woman who'd watched the whole thing unfold, quietly told Marcus his breakfast was on the house and thanked him for doing what needed to be done. Marcus and Snake sat back down at Marcus's original booth, both of them processing what had just happened, the way an ordinary Sunday morning had transformed into a rescue operation. "You thinking about the ones you couldn't save?" Snake asked quietly, knowing Marcus well enough to read the shadows in his eyes. Marcus nodded slowly. "Always. Every time you save one, you remember the ones who slipped through, the ones who never got the chance to signal for help, or who signaled and nobody saw or nobody believed." Snake leaned back in the booth, his arms crossed. "But you saved this one. That matters. That kid is going to have a chance now because you paid attention, because you trusted your gut, because you were willing to make the call even if you might have been wrong. Most people in this restaurant probably noticed something was off about that family, but you're the one who acted." Over the following weeks, Marcus stayed in contact with Linda Kowalski from CYFD, getting updates on Connor's placement and progress as the investigation unfolded. The boy had been placed with an experienced foster family who specialized in trauma care, a couple in their 50s who'd fostered over 30 children over the years and knew how to provide stability and safety while kids healed. Connor started therapy immediately, working with a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma and abuse recovery. The stepfather was formally charged with 12 counts of assault and abuse spanning 3 years. The prosecution building a case based on Connor's testimony, medical evidence, and testimony from neighbors and teachers who'd seen signs but hadn't reported them. The mother's role was more complicated. The investigation revealed that she'd known about some of the abuse, but had convinced herself it wasn't as bad as it was, had made excuses for the stepfather's behavior, had prioritized keeping the family together over protecting her son. She wasn't criminally charged, but she lost custody and was required to complete parenting classes, domestic violence awareness training, and therapy before she could even begin supervised visitation. Connor made it clear through his therapist that he wasn't ready to see her yet, that he needed time to process the betrayal of having a mother who chose her husband over her child's safety. Marcus visited Connor at his foster placement 6 weeks after the IHOP incident, bringing Snake and 2 other Desert Guardians brothers with him. They'd called ahead, coordinated with the foster parents and CYFD, and made sure Connor was comfortable with the visit. When they arrived at the neat suburban house on the west side of Albuquerque, Connor answered the door wearing jeans and a t-shirt with short sleeves, no longer hiding the fading bruises that marked his arms. His foster mother, Angela, stood behind him with a warm smile, welcoming the bikers into her home without hesitation. Connor showed them his room, pointed out the model airplane he was building with his foster father, talked about the new school he'd started attending where nobody knew his history, and he could just be a regular kid. He seemed lighter somehow, like someone had lifted a weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. The Desert Guardians had brought gifts. Nothing elaborate, just a new bike helmet since Connor had mentioned wanting to learn to ride a bicycle, a gift card for the hobby store where he bought his model kits, and a Desert Guardians t-shirt in youth size with the club logo on the front. "You're doing good, kid," Marcus said as they sat in Angela's living room drinking lemonade she'd made. "You're healing." Connor nodded, his hazel eyes clearer than they'd been that morning at IHOP. "It's hard sometimes. I have nightmares. I get scared when people raise their voices. But Angela and Tom, my foster parents, they're really patient. and my therapist is helping me understand that what happened wasn't my fault, that I didn't do anything wrong." He paused, looking at Marcus with an intensity that seemed too old for an 11-year-old. "You know what she told me? That asking you for help was the bravest thing I could have done. That trusting a stranger when I couldn't trust the people who were supposed to love me was smart, not stupid." Marcus felt his eyes burning. "Your therapist is absolutely right. What you did took courage most adults don't have. You saw someone who looked strong enough to help, and you took a chance. That saved your life." Connor played with the hem of his new Desert Guardian shirt. "Why did you help me? You didn't know me. You could have just ignored me like everyone else did." Marcus considered the question carefully, wanting to give this child an honest answer. "I helped you because a long time ago, when I was doing social work, I learned that children don't lie about being hurt. They might not have all the words to explain what's happening, they might minimize or be confused, but when a kid looks at you with desperate eyes and asks for help, they're telling the truth. And I helped you because I've seen too many kids who didn't get help, who slipped through the cracks, who grew up believing nobody cared. I couldn't let you be one of those kids." 3 months after the rescue, Marcus received a call from Linda Kowalski with news. Connor's biological father had been located in Colorado, a man who'd lost custody years earlier due to his own struggles, but who'd since gotten clean, held a steady job, and had been trying to reconnect with his son. With extensive background checks, home studies, and supervised visitation, the plan was to transition Connor back to his father's care over the next 6 months if the relationship rebuilt successfully. Connor was cautiously hopeful, having video calls with his dad weekly, slowly getting to know this man who'd been absent but wanted a second chance. The stepfather was convicted on 10 of the 12 counts and sentenced to 8 years in prison. The mother completed her required programs, but Connor made it clear through his therapist that he wasn't ready for a relationship with her, that forgiveness might come someday, but safety had to come first. She wrote him letters that the therapist reviewed, apologizing, explaining, asking for understanding, and Connor kept them in a box without responding, not ready to engage, but not willing to throw away the possibility of eventual reconciliation. The Desert Guardians. MC added Connor to their list of youth they supported through their community programs. They made sure he had what he needed for school, showed up for his birthday with a new bicycle and a cake, invited him and his foster family to club barbecues and charity rides. When Connor turned 12, they gave him a youth-sized leather vest, not with patches he hadn't earned, but with his name embroidered on the front and honorary member on the back, a symbol that he had family beyond blood, that he belonged to a community that would protect him. Connor grew up knowing that the worst thing that had ever happened to him, the abuse that had stolen years of his childhood, had also led him to people who showed him what real protection looked like, what it meant to be seen and believed and defended. He excelled in school, found passion in building things, model airplanes, and eventually real engines, working alongside his biological father in Colorado after a successful reunification. He stayed in contact with Marcus and Snake, calling on holidays, visiting when he came back to Albuquerque, always carrying that Desert Guardian's business card in his wallet as a reminder that he'd been brave enough to ask for help, and someone had been paying attention enough to answer. Years later, when Connor was 17 and preparing to graduate high school, he wrote an essay for a scholarship application about the moment that changed his life. He wrote about sitting in an IHOP on a Sunday morning, terrified and desperate, making eye contact with a stranger who looked nothing like a hero but who turned out to be exactly what he needed. He wrote about the 4 words he'd mouthed silently, "Please don't tell my stepdad," and how those words had been both a plea for help and a test of whether anyone in the world cared enough to intervene. He wrote about Officer Martinez and Linda Kowalski and his foster parents, Angela and Tom, and his father, working hard to rebuild their relationship. But mostly, he wrote about Marcus, about a biker who could have looked away, who could have decided it wasn't his problem, who could have assumed the best instead of trusting his instincts, but who chose to see and believe and act. The essay earned Connor a full scholarship to study mechanical engineering, and when he walked across the stage at graduation, Marcus and Snake were in the audience wearing their Desert Guardians vests, cheering louder than anyone else. Connor's father sat beside them, sober and proud, having earned back the right to call himself Dad through years of consistent presence and love. After the ceremony, Connor found Marcus in the crowd and hugged him the same way he had in that IHOP 7 years earlier. But this time, it was a hug of gratitude and celebration rather than desperation and fear. The story of Connor and the IHOP rescue became part of Desert Guardian's MC culture, a reminder of why they wore their patches and what those patches represented. It became a training story for new members about awareness and intervention, about the responsibility that came with being visible in the community, about being the kind of people who paid attention when others looked away. The club started a program called See Them, partnering with local schools and community centers to teach children that asking strangers for help in genuine emergencies wasn't breaking the rules about stranger danger, but was exactly what they should do when the adults in their lives failed them. Marcus kept one thing from that Sunday morning, a photo that Officer Martinez had sent him months later, a still frame from the IHOP security camera showing the moment Connor first made eye contact with him across the restaurant. The image was grainy and black and white, but you could see the desperation in the boy's eyes, the rigid posture of someone holding themselves together through sheer will. And if you looked closely, you could see his lips forming the beginning of those 4 silent words. Marcus kept the photo in his wallet, a reminder that paying attention mattered, that trusting your instincts could save lives, that sometimes the most heroic thing you could do was simply see someone who needed to be seen. Because that was the truth at the heart of this story. That children in crisis were often invisible in plain sight, their suffering hidden behind long sleeves and careful smiles, and families that looked normal enough from the outside. That predators counted on people being too busy or too uncomfortable or too conflict-averse to intervene. That the difference between a child escaping abuse and a child enduring it for years longer often came down to one person choosing to pay attention, to trust their gut, to make the uncomfortable phone call or ask the difficult question or refuse to accept the performance of normalcy when every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Connor had been brave enough to ask. Marcus had been present enough to see. And together, they'd proven that awareness and action could stop a nightmare in progress and give a child back his future.